This video is going to help you with the 8th grade plant breeding project, which will be part of your genetics unit. So just to give you a little overview of where and why we save seeds, this is going to be a bean breeding project using the Beefy resilient Grex bean. So that's the bean we are breeding and using as our stock. So first off, just a little bit of an overview of seed diversity then and now. So if you were to look at seed catalogs 100 years ago, you would see this amazing diversity of what used to be available in seed catalogs. For example, 408 varieties of peas, but since people have stopped saving seeds, and there's also been a big buyout of seed companies by some large companies, those 408 varieties of peas are no longer available, and now there's only 25 of those available varieties still around. Many of these varieties have gone extinct, and once something's gone extinct, it is gone forever, which is something you're learning about in 8th grade science. So it's really important that the genetic diversity that we have gets saved in communities, because that's going to be who's actually doing the seed saving and breeding of the future, not big companies. So as you can see, there are 10 seed companies who own 75% of all the seeds planted in the world. And the top 3 of those seed companies, Monsanto, DuPont, and Syngenta, are actually chemical companies, and they own 50% of the world's seed. They also sell the fertilizers and the pesticides that go with those seeds. Some of them are actually developed specifically to use their chemical products with them. So first, let's make sure we have an understanding of what a species and variety is. So we've studied this in 7th grade. So a species is a group of organisms, in our case we're talking about plants, that's capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So for example, tomatoes are a species. And you have the common name tomato, which is what we normally use, but in science it's also good to know the scientific name, which is Solanum lycopersicum, because sometimes things may look similar, but they're actually different, and sometimes things look different and they're actually the same species and can actually pollinate each other. And sometimes common names are confusing because in one place in the world they might call something one thing, like a tomato and a tomato, but those are actually the same. But there are some common names that are actually confusing and misleading. Variety. So variety are things that have an appearance that is distinct from other varieties. These will often hybridize freely, which means that the offspring are a mix of the 2 parents. So some common tomato varieties are Brandywine, Stupus, and in our area, the San Francisco Fog. So each of these varieties looks different. Some of them might be like yellow tomatoes, and some of them might be pear-shaped, but they're all actually tomatoes, but they have distinct characteristics, or as we would say, phenotypes, the way that they look. Okay, pollination. So there's a couple of different things we need to know about pollination. One is that some plants are self-pollinating. That takes place within a single flower, usually before the flower is even opened. And the offspring, the seeds and the plants that come out of those self-pollinating plants, are true to type. True to type means it exhibits the characteristics of the variety. So for example, if I plant it, it's going to look like, if it's San Francisco Fog tomato, it's going to look like San Francisco Fog tomato. So it's true to type. Cross-pollination happens when pollen is exchanged between different flowers, and it could be the same type of plant, or it could be a different variety. Hybrids occur when pollen comes from a different variety. This could be intentional, such as a human's trying to create a new variety so they can take pollen from one variety to another, or it can be unintentional, or just nature doing its thing, such as this bee bringing pollen from one plant to another. And we often give honeybees a lot of credit, but there are actually thousands, like 2,000 types of bees in California and about 20,000 bees around the world. So let's I know talking about pollination can be a little bit tricky, so looking at some pictures might help us a little bit. So let's look at some pictures. So this is a perfect flower. And what you mean by a perfect flower is that within a single flower, there are the male and the female parts. Some of these type are also self-pollinating, which means the pollen from this will go into the female. In the case of beans, they're extremely self-pollinating, which means, oopsie daisy, which means that often before the flower is even opened, the pollen has gotten onto the female parts, pollination has occurred, and even sometimes fertilization has occurred. So even if when the plant opens and a bee or some other insect brings pollen from another plant, from a different variety, it doesn't matter because it's already done its business. Some plants, on the other hand, have different male and female flowers, and so these are often insect pollinated. So an insect might come from the male to the female. If it's from the same plant or the same variety, those flowers, those offspring will be like their parents. So let's kind of look at an example of that. Okay, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid, typically when we're saving seeds, we're trying to avoid cross-pollination. So that's the main thing we're trying to do when we're saving seeds, and we want them to come out like the parent. So things that typically we're trying to do is the bee or some other insect gets pollen from the same flower and brings it into that same flower, same variety. Great, that's going to come out like the parent. Or it could be a different flower on the same plant or a different flower on the same variety on a different plant, and the pollen goes from this flower over this flower, and the offspring are going to be true to type, which means they're going to be like their parents. Typically when we're saving seeds, we're trying to avoid this, which is an insect or even the wind takes pollen from one plant of a different variety to the variety we're trying to save, and then the offspring is going to be a mix of the two parents. Now, when saving beans, plants of the same species, when saving seeds, plants of the same species but different varieties often have to be separated by large distances to prevent unwanted cross-pollination. For example, with squash, you need to separate one variety of squash from another variety of squash by a quarter to a half a mile unless you do some hand pollination and you try to exclude the insects from doing the pollination. However, beans are one of the super easy plants to save because they're extremely self-pollinating. So once again, before the plant's even opened, they've been fertilized, pollinated and fertilized, so they tend to come out true to type. So it's also nice to know that there are several different species of beans. So typically most of the things that you eat are the common bean, which is the scientific name is Phaseola vulgaris. So the pinto bean, Gucho bean, the great Aunt Rosie's Italian pole beans, if you save those. In 6th grade when you did seed folks, you were studying about the lima beans, the Phaseola lunatus. There's fava beans, there's runner beans, and then there's tepary beans, which we tend not to grow very much in California. This tends to be much more of a Southwest, very heat-tolerant plant. This is Phaseola acutifolius. So there's big field, white, black, whatever. So there's different types. There's different varieties within the different types of beans. Now, there was an interesting thing that happened with this seed breeder. So Carol Deppy, this is what brings us to 8th grade science right now. So Carol Deppy is this amazing plant geneticist. She has a PhD in genetics from Harvard. She specializes in developing public domain crops. These are crops that she's developing for the benefit of society with the hope that they will be able to do well under organic conditions versus that original picture where you saw most of our seed is owned by chemical companies. So she's working to create things that are organic seeds, that they thrive in organic conditions, not having to use pesticides, really looking for how can we develop seeds that are going to support human survival for the next 1,000 years. She is also the author of Breed Your Own Vegetables. So several years ago, she happened to have planted a Gucho bean, which is a common bean, Phaseola vulgaris, pretty close to a tepary bean, Phaseola acutifolius. These are different species, although they are in the same genus, they have the same phaseolus, so they should not typically cross, especially since, as I mentioned, beans tend to be extremely self-pollinating. However, she noticed that her gold gaucho beans, which is a common bean, and her black Mitla tepary bean actually came out with her gaucho beans actually came out with some black seeds the first year. And she's like, whoa, something happened. So she noticed that the beans had crossed. So she saved the seeds. And when she planted out these came out black, which they shouldn't have. She ended up getting this wild mix that she's called Beefy, Resilient Grex Bean. And she gifted me a bunch of these beans, and we're growing them out to see if we can create a new variety and stabilize this variety. And one thing she says about this bean is the beans taste more beefy than beef does. So we're going to be saving these, and we're going to come up with our own idea about what we're going to save for, whether or not we want to save for the most genetic diversity or early or whatever. So you are each, as a table group, going to get a container of one bean plant. You're also going to get the sheet that says the date it was collected. These ones were burgundy, and it had a plant number on it. And then you're going to basically take off the pods, and you're going to count how many bean pods, and you're going to record that. So this was 15. Also make sure you include your names on this. Then you're going to take the beans out of the pods, and you're going to count how many beans there were. I would recommend putting them in piles of 10 for ease of counting. You're going to put the total number of beans, and then you're going to use the key to determine what type this is. So like this is the black pinto. So there's a couple of different types of black ones based on different sizes. Then you're also going to make a note if it's a bush bean or a runner bean. So if you look back here, this is a bush bean. It is not vining, it's just kind of a short, stumpy little bush. So if it was, you're going to mention bush bean or half runner bean. Okay. Then you're going to calculate the average beans per pod. You're going to show the calculations there and then round it to the nearest whole number. And then you're going to take your paper and your beans, and you're going to show the paper to your teacher. So the teacher can see, oh, this is the burgundy beans. So you're going to put all of your beans in the burgundy jar. Yes, we're putting black beans in a burgundy jar because we're basing it on the mother plant. And then we're going to plant those out next year, and we're going to keep seeing what happens, and we're going to actually create a new variety that is going to be in the public domain for the benefit of society. So enjoy, and hope this was helpful.